This is Principles of Ecosystem Ecology, Chapter 11. Species effects on ecosystem processes. The potential biota for an ecosystem and the species present in ecosystems are two of the main state factors and interactive controls that ecosystems have. The nature and diversity of species traits and the interactions among organisms strongly affect ecosystems. This chapter covers how species specifically affect some of the key functions of ecosystems. People have massively altered the species composition of the biosphere. Of all the changes that we've made, changes in species abundance are among the most important. Now, these changes in species abundance include both ways that we've increased the abundance of some species and decreased the abundance in others. At the most extreme, some of these decreases are associated with extinctions. So, for example, if I'd like to show my kids what mammoths look like, we have to go to natural history museums. And there we can see the skeletons of extinct mammoths, Columbian mammoths, for example, or some of the pygmy mammoths that existed on islands during the Holocene. When these creatures walked the landscapes, they had massive effects on not only the vegetation, but also the way that water, nutrients, and energy were cycled. Now, this is just one of the many extinctions that have happened on Earth, and the extinctions of the mammoths may have been influenced by climate, but they were definitely caused by humans. Other species have gone extinct more recently. Some of them have had less effects, others greater effects than mammoths would have during those times. But the extinctions are a very important process by which ecosystems have been impacted by our actions. In addition to extinctions, there have also been a number of introductions of species to ecosystems. Now, this is not the creation wholesale of new species, but instead the movement of species from one ecosystem to another, and changing the potential biota that is present in a species in an ecosystem, as well as the species that are actually present in that ecosystem. The introductions of species, the movement of species from one ecosystem to another, far outweigh the number of extinctions that we've had so far, although there's a lot more extinctions happening than there used to be. This is a Burmese python, which has been introduced to the Florida Everglades. There's no species functionally like it, and it has all but decimated the wildlife within that ecosystem. Zebra mussels are another example of a species that has been introduced for which there is no functional equivalent within that ecosystem. The Great Lakes within North America have had introductions of zebra mussels, and zebra mussels have radically altered the functioning of those ecosystems. Now, the examples that I've used previously were from animals, but plants have also been introduced throughout the world. This is an example of amber honeysuckle in Missouri. It's totally taken over the understory of that system and changes the way that light, water, and nutrients cycle within the ecosystems. Now, it seems like a focal issue for species extinctions and introductions should be pretty easy. Exotic species sometimes change the physical and biotic environment enough to alter the abundance of or even eliminate native species from an ecosystem. So this more so has to do with plant communities and animal communities that are present in an ecosystem and the elimination of native species by introductions of others. But often the way that exotic species impact the abundance of native species is how they can change the physical and biotic environment, the way that they alter nutrient cycling, the way they shade other plants by taking up light. So in just some of my travels, for example, when we go to New Zealand, we would work in high elevation grasslands. And these are grasslands that formerly were above the tree line of the native trees. So we have large tussock grasses that would cover entire hill slopes by the time you got up above tree line. But it turns out that the native tree line in New Zealand is actually relatively low compared to tree lines in other parts of the world. And when we introduce pines that do well at high elevations in other parts of the world, they've taken over large swaths of area that were formerly these tussock grasslands. In addition, some of the introductions of species have been for agronomic purposes and are considered beneficial. For example, in New Zealand, a lot of the grasses that are used in pastures, not necessarily at the highest elevations, but at high elevations and mid elevations. So you can see in the background there's a large sheep farm, and these pastures right here might be used for haying. All of the grass species that are here were imported from Europe. And Europe just had different grasses than New Zealand did. And although there was a large number of grasses that were present in New Zealand, none of them had the characteristics of these grasses that were imported from Europe. In part, that's because New Zealand never had any native mammals. And so the idea of having grasses that would do well under grazing by mammals just wasn't present in the flora. And in order to be able to import grazers like sheep, for example, they also needed to import those grasses too. Having these grasses in the ecosystem fundamentally changes the productivity of the ecosystem and how it responds to disturbance. For species impacting disturbance, another example here is bufflegrass. Bufflegrass is known as Pennisetum is the genus, and it's transformed the Sonoran Desert in the southwestern U.S. In large part, the Sonoran Desert did not have a lot of grass in it. But Pennisetum does relatively well under these conditions and can produce high biomass. That has an effect on other species, but one of the main ways that Pennisetum or bufflegrass impacts the other species is by promoting fire. So by having large fuel loads, that when fire comes through the system, it's able to burn a large number of the Pennisetum, but also take out other species that aren't adapted well to fire. So saguaro cactus, for example, shown here, is an iconic species in this ecosystem. But it has no evolutionary history with fire. These systems just didn't burn. But now we're able to introduce a species that's able to change the disturbance regime, and that has impacts for other species in the ecosystem. So the dramatic increase in extinctions and introductions in recent decades is rapidly changing the patterns of biodiversity of the planet. The displacement of those species is relatively easy to observe, but it raises fundamental questions about the functioning of ecosystems and how different species can impact ecosystem processes that then have these downstream effects on the abundance of other species. So as some of the focal questions are concerned, which species changes are most likely to have large ecosystem consequences? A given grassland, for example, could have 600 species in it, somewhere on that order. A forest, as much or more than that. But not all of those species, if we remove them or if we add another species, are likely to have large consequences for the ecosystem. So what is it about a species that, if we introduce it or take it away, are going to have these large consequences for how that ecosystem functions? And another question that we have to think about and focus our attention on is to be able to develop strategies to minimize the likelihood of introducing these species to new places. So it's one thing to say we know what it is about a species that if we introduce it or take it away, is going to radically alter the functioning of that ecosystem. But then, from an ecosystem perspective, are there things that we can do to alter the way the ecosystem functions to prevent these species from being introduced or taking hold in an ecosystem?